Time to talk all things tariffs with Renai Moothilal, who's the CEO of the National Association of Automotive Components and Allied Manufacturers. This comes as President Donald Trump has announced yet more tariffs, new 25% levies on U.S. imports of steel and aluminum that would come into effect on March 12th. Renai, thank you so much for your time. I mean, March 12th is not too far away, and you almost get a sense from the White House that there will be no exceptions, no exemptions. How are you making sense of some of the, executive orders that are coming through from the Oval Office?
Thanks for having me. I think your intro is actually an interesting one, and especially from an auto sector context, in that when you talk about no exemptions and no exceptions, in a weird way, that's actually not a bad thing for South Africa, because the kind of tariffs that you're talking about in the primary steel and aluminium sector, steel has for a number of years now had that 25% tariff attached to it. What Trump has effectively done, or our understanding of it, is it's now applied across all countries globally. For a long time, there were many countries who had exemptions. South Africa was not one of those. So at least in the steel side of things, weirdly, this may end up with some sort of leveling the playing fields. However, it's not a good thing, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Aluminium is probably where there's a bit more concern, in that aluminium primary exports into the U.S. were previously at 10%, and now an across-the-board increase up to 25%. So if you look at the combined aluminium and steel exports into the U.S. were probably somewhere around 13 billion per annum, I think, and of that, about 8 billion, and of that 13% going into the U.S. So I think what that could be doing in a U.S. context, and how we relate it back to autos, it could possibly see a situation where the U.S. economy themselves become more competitive in terms of their production. And that for a South African autos outlook is not necessarily the good thing. We don't want to lose any of our automotive exports into the market. If I think particularly in aluminium context, the danger here is that we've got companies, and you would know the aluminium companies quite well. Hulamin is both a big exporter of primary goods into the US, but also a big supplier here into the automotive sector. If you have a situation where Hulamin, for whatever reason, does not get to export over the long term the same levels that it's been doing, that then has an impact on the competitiveness of its own business case for supply in South Africa, and long term not good for a localization outlook in a country that's looking to drive up the localization levels in vehicles.
I mean, since we've had the inauguration of President Trump, and I think in that election campaign, as we got closer and closer to January 20th when he was inaugurated, we were already talking about what tariffs could look like. When you're having a conversation with your association members, what are some of the concerns, not just from a tariff perspective, but in terms of what's happening in the automotive sector within the country? Where are the issues and the challenges when you have that discussion?
So I think let's not deviate too much from what we're talking about in a tariff, or let's call it the wider kind of geopolitical, trade and economic context that we see. We are seeing many countries and regions moving towards higher levels of protectionism. For the South African auto sector, not necessarily a great thing, as we are highly export dominant. I mean, you've got a situation where by far the majority of South African produced vehicles end up in export markets. What's interesting in the U.S. context is we are hopeful that this general increase in tariffs that he's starting to put across in some of the primary mineral space is not necessarily not a precursor to where the AGOA discussion. And I think in the auto sector, what happens in the AGOA space is definitely a hot topic. It's something that both from a vehicle assembly and a component producer point of view, it's a critical part of our competitiveness levels, and the U.S. market for exports under is really important. So other than what I've kind of touched on in an export context related to tariffs and by wider extension of AGOA, I do think some of the other challenges that we faced with here domestically include what we've been seeing over the last 18 months is a loss of, I suppose, domestic vehicle by the 7 large producers. They're losing significant share to cheaper imports. That on its own creates issues around the number of vehicles that are produced in the country and what my own kind of constituency supplies to those vehicles. Our own kind of outlook for the year, kind of flat, not significant growth in terms of vehicles being produced, and other factors influencing. I mean, let's be honest, right now, globally, we're sitting with a high level of uncertainty in terms of how trade relationships are going to work. Here in South Africa, we've recently seen the issues around steel supply and the announced closure and then postponement of that closure around the ArcelorMittal plant, a really key input factor into autos manufacturing. So I think the issues around the changing market, changing technologies, some struggles we're seeing in the supply of raw materials, all of those is kind of giving us a stuck in the mud kind of outlook for 2025.
With that stuck in the mud outlook, I mean, for the viewers who are watching this interview, and as you said, it's a flat outlook, it's stuck in the mud, just to use your words. Are there any green shoots, any reasons to seem optimistic and hopeful about the path ahead for 2025?
Look, I mean, green shoots are always out there if you look hard enough. And I think let's talk to the US context. What we may find is this move by Trump may end up with a situation where he's effectively increased the cost of input materials that have typically been imported into the US economy. If for whatever reason the US economy cannot respond at the same levels of pricing and their own production gets expensive, then you've got some opportunities around increasing the South African exports into that market. The auto exports into the US market are actually really key. I mean, it contributes a significant level both to the assembly and the aftermarket and consumer usage in the US. So it's a fairly significant supplier into that space already. I believe if Trump's move does not increase their own domestic competitiveness, opportunities for greater exports are around. I do think as some of our domestic vehicles transition into some of the new plug-in hybrid and electric vehicle technology, the opportunities for greater supply does exist. I think when I was talking about a flat or stuck in the mud outlook, there's still a possibility that there are slim levels of growth, but that would depend on, to some extent, recovery of these brands and how they respond in some of the big export markets, including the EU, which for a long term has been a key trading partner. I also think there's opportunities for greater localization and deepening of the value chain. Aluminium is actually a really good example. Aluminium products going into some of the new platforms and production lineups is an opportunity for greater aluminium supply of components here in the domestic market. So yeah, they are definitely green shoots. It just has been a bit of a challenging time. We need to accept that, and I think there are probably a few policy responses that can come to play to assist the South African auto sector pick up and move towards its long-term, still positive outlook under a very clear industrial policy that we have called the SA Autos Master Plan to 2035.
Those policy responses, I mean, what should they look like? I mean, should we be expecting them over the next few months or so, or is it a case where we kind of become reactive, for lack of a better word, and just see how these conversations around tariffs play out?
I think the South African government has a very clear marching order, I suppose, in terms of how to prioritize relationships from an economic perspective with the US to protect what we have under the AGOA arrangement. I think that's going to be a key intervention that the authorities will be engaged in the coming weeks. So definitely from policy perspective, what are the negotiation points that they can work with to ensure that South Africa remains a very key supplier into that market. I do think as we look domestically, there's probably some review and tweaks to what we know as the Autos Production and Development Program on how to better optimize the domestic market growth into some of the African markets. Those are all discussions that ourselves, our partners in the vehicle assembly space, Labour and government have on a regular basis, and we look forward to bringing some of that to finality under what has generally been, and I must state this, what has generally been a fairly long-running mandate of support for autos manufacturing in South Africa.
Renai, thank you so much for your time. That was Renai Moothilal, who is the CEO of the National Association of Automotive Components and Allied Manufacturers. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll look at a conversation that I had with the Development Bank of Southern Africa.